Hello, my name is James Benson, a historian from Middle Tennessee who focuses on bringing stories to life and showing how we can all learn from even the smallest stories we find. As a student at Middle Tennessee State University, this video is a requirement for the finalization of my Master's Public History degree. It will run alongside my master's thesis, War on the Rivers, and is inspired by other academic YouTubers such as Drachinifel and storytellers such as the Fat Electrician. This video is purpose-made to show academics the usefulness of mostly free media resources such as YouTube to spread information for both entertainment and educational purposes. As a public historian and as a student, I have seen two forms of history that I find incredibly important. The first part would be that of the academic. It's your peer-reviewed articles, your textbooks, your documentaries on PBS, on the History Channel. While this form is relatively boring, it's minute, it's mundane, you do have others that write on certain topics, and while most people outside of academics don't read these or know they exist most of the time, they're still good because it's your historiography, it's your interpretations, it's events being spoken about, researched, and seen throughout texts and media of many different kinds of ways, but it's something that is just there. It's your academics. Typically, only academics will find these, peer review them, and then typically it's students that read these books. And yeah, they can push this out to their friends, family, but typically an academic's point of view is not seen outside of academia. The other half, the important parts that are seen, are typically found in museums, small little posts and placards across the United States, across the world. You see history every day, but most people don't examine, don't explore it. And that's where the second part of history comes in, the storyteller. As a public historian, oratory history is incredibly important because it's folk tales. It's things that haven't been recorded or that have been passed down generation to generation. This was the original form of history. The way to learn was through the elders, through the past. And today we have forgotten that mostly. Of course, we still have talks and debates. We can still find storytellers today, some of which are extremely successful. One of which being the Fat Electrician here on YouTube. His stories, his way of telling a story are so great that it impacts millions of lives. And he researches his topics. He, while not a traditional academic, does his due diligence to hold those standards of an academic. He researches, he goes through, and he even adds his own insight as a former military man himself. He adds his insight into topics that may have muddled waters as someone who looks at history. While that might not be the correct thing to do always, it's something that I see as useful. But storytellers can put their own flair to it. They can add their own experience. And to me, that's one of the greatest parts about history, is you can connect to it. And storytellers are able to connect anyone to most stories. And that's why I see them as important as a public historian. And that's why I wish to be another one who fills that gap between the two. I have experienced and I have pushed for different ideas. I have learned many, many good skills. I've learned to cook better uh, through culinary history, which is one of my favorite forms of history because it involves both food and history. And here on YouTube, you could see Max Miller's Tasting History or Dylan Hollis with his shorts here on YouTube and on TikTok, both of which have several cookbooks between them with many great recipes, many of which I've tried because I have their cookbooks. But we, as historians, can inspire people to learn new skills, to find out what they want to do in life. As someone who taught middle and high school, I find inspiring the next generation is hard, but if you have charisma, if you have passion, you can show that they can have passion as well into so many different things, and they can succeed in their goals just by trying a little harder. And that is the most important parts of history, I find. And as we look to those who can inspire us, we also have to look back at ourselves and realize that our lives are something that we can do so many things with. Today, we will be looking into the story of a young sailor, first-class boy, James Alphaeus Dickinson, a sailor on board the USS Tawa during the American Civil War, sailing up and down the Mississippi River system. His diary can be found at the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library Archive in Dickinson's hometown of Fremont, Ohio, and can be read off their website. And as a shout out to their archive team, I thank you guys so much for your assistance in writing my thesis and for your just putting up with me from whenever your diary website was down. I thank you for all your help in getting the research done and getting his diary. Born May 22nd, 1849, to Margaret and Rudolph Dickinson in Fremont, Ohio. James Alphaeus Dickinson's life was not well recorded during this period. We do know that his family found lawsuits in the estate as his father did die several months prior to his birth. This would go on before, during, and after the Civil War, as the estate was being prospected by men of the community who wanted portions of the land. We do not know if any succeeded, but we do know that his brother would eventually become a lawyer and follow in the path of his father, becoming a politician in his local area. However, during the first portion of the Civil War, we do not know much about James Dickinson's life. He was only 10 when Fort Sumter was shelled and the war began. When he was 13, on May 14th, 1863, he would buy a diary and begin writing in it. This diary would go all the way to May 1864, where he would buy another, and that would be used as an addendum. But he would enlist in the United States Navy on May 16th, 1863, 4 days before his birthday. A Lieutenant Caudle out of Cleveland, Ohio, would be the one to sign his papers, making him a first-class boy as a powder monkey in the United States Navy, specifically for the Western Flotilla. First, we will talk about what role he played on the ship. A powder monkey is the individual who hauls charges of black powder for cannons. The Merriam-Webster definition is a person who carries or has charge of explosives, as in blasting operations. This term's first use was in 1697, but we know that during this period, this position was typically filled by young men and boys, as they were able to traverse the ship with ease compared to the larger men who actually manned, aimed, and fired the cannons. Next, let's talk about the Western Flotilla. As the Civil War broke out, the idea was it was going to be a short war. Winfield Scott had the idea that this would be longer and drawn out, and thus he created the Anaconda Plan, which would eventually be used by the Union. This idea would do two things. First, it would separate the Confederacy by the Mississippi River, and divide it even further using the Cumberland, the Tennessee, the White, and the Red Rivers, at least on the western portion of the Confederacy. The other thing would be to starve it of material, of food and war resources, so that the war efforts would be slowly diminished and the Confederacy could not fight on a logistical standpoint. While the South was full of natural resources, it did not have many ways to refine and produce its own war goods, so this was needed. And separating the western half of the country would thus cut the Confederacy half, and the western half would have to fend for itself, but it could still have land trade. The eastern half did not have that luxury. But to do this, you needed a navy, one that specialized in rivers, and that's where the Western Flotilla came in. First headed by Andrew Foote, who would last until 1862, when, suffering from injuries he gained at the battles of Fort Donelson and Henry, he would eventually retire, and it would be passed down to Admiral Porter, the same Porter that is known for the Porter-class destroyer found in World War II. On February 6, 1862, Fort Henry would fall to General Grant and Admiral Foote. The importance of this fort was that it allowed the Union to have a logistical standing in Middle Tennessee. This and its sister fort at Fort Donelson, which held the Cumberland River and would fall on the 12th of February, kept the Union out. Now in Union hands, Grant would march to Nashville, capturing it and allowing Middle Tennessee to be held by the Union, and allowing the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers to be used by the Union Navy. The only thing holding the Union back on either of these rivers would be destroyed in Florence, Alabama, and it would be razed, and that would become the USS Fair Play. However, when we look west, on March 14th, New Madrid was captured by the Union. This was the first of several fortifications along the Mississippi River protecting Memphis. These forts were all placed high up on bluffs, a bluff being a raised embankment above a river that was used for a defensive location. During this period, many of the ships on the rivers were ironclad ships. They were lighter draft, and the sides were all iron-plated, but the weakest part was the top. A well-placed cannon on a bluff could destroy one of these ships, or at least damage it easier than a ship lower to the bank, or from another ship. After the Fort of New Madrid, the next main opponent to the Union Navy on the Mississippi River would be Island Number 10. They would have several lighter ships run past during the evenings of the 4th and the 6th, but on the 8th they would capture Island Number 10 as it was abandoned by Confederates for another well-placed position known as Fort Pillow. On April 12th, the siegement of Fort Pillow would begin. Fort Pillow, more well known for the massacre of Fort Pillow in 1864, commenced by Nathan Bedford Forrest, was originally constructed by the Confederates. Named after Gideon Pillow, a Mexican-American war veteran who assisted the Confederate cause by mobilizing the state for the Confederates, it would be built by Montgomery Lynch, a captain of the Confederate cause. This siege would see one major engagement from the Confederate Navy, where it would be sent back. This engagement known as the Battle of Plum Point Bend. Almost a month after the Battle of Plum Point Bend, Fort Pillow would be abandoned by the Confederate occupiers, and the Union would capture it. 2 days later, on June 6th, the Battle of Memphis would happen. In this battle, most of the Confederate Navy was sunk and or captured by the Union. During this period, only one ship was able to return to Confederate lines. After Memphis, there was only one bastion the Confederates held on the Mississippi River. The Union was slowly pincering this one point, Vicksburg. Vicksburg would be captured in June of 1863, and it would divide the Confederacy in two. Dickinson, in his diary, would hear cheers as the report of Vicksburg falling came down the Tennessee River. But what had Dickinson been doing for all of this time leading up to the defeat of the Confederate forces at Vicksburg? Dickinson, while on the Clara Dulcet, would see several ships come alongside, brand new ships that would be inducted into the United States Navy, such as the USS Argosy, which Dickinson, of course, would be placed on, or was supposed to be on. Dickinson was hiding with his friend Errata Sherman, who brought him food and would give him hardtack and molasses while he hid on the lower decks of the Dulcin. He deserted. Yeah, I'm just going to say it now. He essentially deserted this because he wanted to stay with his friends. If not, his diary would have been different. After the USS Argosy left, he had joined the crew for breakfast and was given the punishment of rolling a 68-pound ball up and down a crack in the ship for 2 days. During this period, he would be harassed by a buffalo soldier, and a start would fight between the two. The soldier would get the same punishment as Dickinson for 4 hours that same day. That same night, Dickinson would also cut the soldier's hammock, so it would snap when it was laid on. June 11th, that day where he would cut the hammock, well, the morning after he cut the hammock, the ship, the Fanny, was brought into port and laid upon side, the Dulcin. It would be made into a turtle boat, but this ship would eventually have Dickinson be placed on it. As of June 16th, he would be drafted with 6 other boys and 8 men to help work up the ship. Working up being the point in a ship's life where you would test the engine, make sure all of the weapons were placed properly and could function well. This ship, it needed help, as it needed its cannons placed and fitted onto the ship as it would. It would have 2 of the rare Wyard guns, WIARD, mounted as well. And the end, on the 18th, the ship would have 45 men and boys come on board extra, and the tugboat Myrtle would tow it out the river. On June 19th, 1863, the Fanny would be given a new name. Christened the USS Tarawa, she would begin steam towards Mound City, getting within 2 miles before returning back to Cairo and her anchorage to load supplies. On the 20th, after loading more supplies, she would start off down the Mississippi River. Most of her crew would immediately become sick, as they would drink from the Mississippi River, and she would continue all the way down to Memphis. On her way to Memphis, she would pass the USS General Bragg on the 22nd. The General Bragg, being a side-wheel ram, previously known as the CSS General Bragg, guarded the Red River in Helena, Arkansas. This would be the same location Dickinson and the Tawa would coal up before continuing on to Memphis, where they would arrive on the 25th of June. On the 28th of June, they would head back up the river to Cairo, Illinois, recoaling twice and drilling, damage control, and fired. One individual had fallen off, a Adam Schaffhelt, but he would be retrieved with the ship's cutter. On June 30th, 1863, the ship would change hands from Captain Phelps to Captain Jason Goody. Well, the new captain saw a new assignment, and they would be assigned to the Tennessee Squadron on the Tennessee River, beginning their journey on the 1st of July, heading to Paducah, Kentucky. On the 3rd, they would head down to Fort Hyman, and then, with a portion of the crew, on July 6th, they would head to Fort Henry, where 40 of the men on the cutter would be engaged by bushwhackers outside the fort. These bushwhackers likely came from Mississippi, as on the 7th, they would find signs of these bushwhackers, mostly a belt that was found in a blood-stained brush. From here, we can talk about several of the different roles. Dickinson, in most of his diary, would engage guerrillas and raiders. In Tennessee and Arkansas, these two areas had smaller rivers. You didn't have larger gunboats like the Caradelet going down them as often. You also had the need for supply lines to come through, compared to railroads, which can be engaged from any side or entirely halted by a section of the track being destroyed or tampered with. You can't do that with ships. On the Cumberland River, you have shoals like the Harpeth Shoals, which, for a portion of the war, blocked off the entire river from both sides being able to use it efficiently because the river was too shallow, and any ship that went into the shoals would ground itself and be easy pickings for raiders, guerrillas, normal army units. The Tennessee River didn't have this problem, and thus you have the Battle of Shiloh, where at Pittsburgh Landing, several Union gunboats and mortar boats were used quite effectively by the Union as both fire support and to transport troops across the river. But the Western Flotilla, one of its main purposes, was to fight guerrillas, raiders, partisans, fighting anything that could hinder logistics lines. The raiders that could easily hit a set of trains had a harder time finding the spots needed to engage a ship effectively. Yes, there were bluffs and bends which can be used to get close to a ship, but those aren't always around, and all the points that are apparent, most of the time your ability for surprise is not there, or it's currently being used as a fort by the Union, or a trading location. July 13th would see mail being received by the USS Robb. During this period, they would be going up and down the river, coaling up, and, well, on the 13th, they would receive news that 30,000 soldiers had surrendered at Vicksburg, and that General Meade and General Lee had come to an engagement at Gettysburg. Thus, General Lee would retreat. To two large victories, the ship would celebrate, firing 34 shots off and traveling to Island Number 2 in Tennessee, also known as Turkey Island, where they would hunt for turkeys, one of which being given to the mess to cook for the crew, which is something that was seen frequently on the ship, uh, having to go out and get resources. Initially, it was just food, and this was rare as the ship did have plenty of salted meats, vegetables, and hardtack to sustain itself, but extra rations was always welcomed. At this time, they also did not have any coal shortages, and any coal shortages could be relieved by the small craft found on the shores of the river that they would break up. They would break up small canoes, rafts, and other boats for firewood, but also to keep them out of the hands of the Confederates. They wanted to make sure that all crossings of the Tennessee River were done in Union-controlled areas such as Savannah, Tennessee, Johnsonville, Tennessee, and Clifton, though many of these areas would come in and out of Union control due to raiders. Johnsonville, Fort Hyman, and such would be held primarily by the Union, but Confederate raids would become a problem later in the war, as you will see. But July 17th saw the Tawa in its first combat engagement. Dickinson would not be shot, but one of his friends would be shot at, and two people would be injured from the bluffs of Carrollville. Carrollville, which is no longer a town, but still the name of a hill outside of Clifton, would be at the top of a hill, and while the ship's elevation wouldn't be able to hit either the Confederates at the top, the gun elevation could be changed on the USS Tawa. It had a more open layout. It was still armored, but it did have drawbacks of both the crew being able to be hit easier, and the top, which could be hit easier by cannon fire at the top of bluffs, was likely easier to damage and possibly destroy. Though the USS Tawa was, at the period, relatively praised for how the ship would react in armor and how new it was to the fleet. After this, there were two injuries on the ship. Both were considered alright by the ship's doctor, and on the 19th, the Army scouts on the ship under Captain Phillips would be hunting for General Rosecrans's army. They would stop several ways back on their way to Fort Hyman, in which the ship returned to was recoaled, and the scouting party sent back out on the 20th. On the 21st, while a ship was trying to flee from the port, the USS Tawa would fire upon it and return it to port. In the diary, there was no other mentions of what the ship's name was or why it was trying to leave port, but either it was stolen or orders were given and no one was notified. On the 22nd, there were Confederate raiders that would engage the USS Tawa. The USS Key West would escort a ship called the Mussel along an area known as the Bridge House, likely downriver from Fort Hyman. But the Tawa would hear and come to the Key West's assistance. 3 Confederate raiders were killed, and there were no casualties on the Union side. They would send parties to shore next day to bury dead, but the dead were moved, and they would find 2 canoes and a raft. They were both destroyed on boat. The damage to the ship was taken account for, only 4 holes in the main smokestack, and the wooden sides on the upper decks were well peppered. July 24th saw the Tawa return to Fort Hyman, where she would find the USS Exchange raising 2 barges by herself. The USS Exchange would raise 3 barges in total, while the Tawa, after helping out, would raise 2 by herself. The next day, they would find the USS Rob arriving after being engaged by guerrillas downriver. She was tasked with guarding the barges after arriving, and on the 26th, the USS Tawa would head upriver to the bridge where they had been previously engaged, and they would be fired at during the night by a mass of men. They would disperse it with their own cannons, but due to lack of coal, they would begin gathering wood. This is a substitute, but it is a lower quality substitute to coal, and they would have to re-wood several times. On the 27th, they would send a shore party of 30 to look for Davis's Groundhogs, a guerrilla band operating in Middle Tennessee. Dickinson would be placed on wood gathering duty, and they were engaged by guerrillas less than a mile away from the boat. They would continue to an unnamed island, where on the 28th, a Mr. Adams would head off into the main part as a scouting party before heading back upriver. Mr. Adams would arrive the next day with 3 prisoners, one of which was wounded, and the USS Exchange and USS Fanny Barker would meet them at the bridge. July 30th, 1863. The USS Key West would arrive with a small squadron of ships, and they would send out a 200-man party to help capture a rebel conscription group. They were halted 2 miles away from their departure point and forced to retreat. When they came in range of the guns, the Confederates were fired and scattered. Only 1 person from the USS Tawa was injured, a Will Simons, who was shot in the leg by a pistol. The next day, a Confederate deserter who was wounded by spherical case rounds reported that lots of Confederates were killed. Dickinson would wash the decks down as the ships went downriver. August 1st would see them cutting up canoes and large rafts. They would take a family of refugees on board, and Dickinson would of course reminisce of home, as he did not like eating hardtack and salt pork. On the 3rd, the ship would mostly finish recoaling at Fort Hyman, and all the ships in the squadron would be separating to their different stations. The Tawa would leave on the 4th once the USS Paw Paw arrived to protect barges. On the 4th and going into the 5th, Dickinson would continue to play his part as a guard. He would eventually fall down of exhaustion while guarding Confederate officers and be placed on sick leave. On August 7th, while in sick leave, the ship would encounter a group of contraband. Contraband being former slaves who were released from their imprisonment and given their freedom. Contraband usually collected close to forts and Union positions, and these would create contraband camps. Fun fact, or not so fun fact, these would eventually become a lot of the black neighborhoods found in the South, many of them keeping their same name. The one in my area is known as Bucket of Blood, but these contraband camps were the foundation to black neighborhoods and black communities in the South today. On the 8th, 3 more refugees came aboard, one of which continued on his way, but 2 would enlist, such as a Watkins. Dickinson would stay on sick leave, with Watkins, who was placed in sick leave due to a gunshot wound. On the 9th, they would shell the Clifton Hydraulics Works after receiving gunfire from the building. They would destroy the building promptly before heading on their way. On the 10th, the pickets that were defending Wood crews would be attacked by Captain Wheat, who captured a sailor by the name of Powers. Several days later, Powers would actually swim back to the boat in the early morning hours after faking an injury and getting away from Captain Wheat. Meanwhile, as he was escaping, the crew was wooding up again. This trend of being engaged by guerrillas and raiders would continue while they were on the Tennessee River. Being engaged by bluffs around Clifton and Carrollville, from areas like the bridge, where from the pilot house they could be engaged from, even if the Confederates knew that the Union ships had it sighted in pretty well at most points of time. They would be engaged at all points of the river. On the 27th, Dickinson would become wounded. He would be grazed in the left forearm by a musket ball, both laming his wrist and causing a burn. While that day he did maintain his post, the next day he was excused, but he was not put on the sick list. After this engagement, they would continue, and for the rest of August and the summer, they would travel back to Paducah after. On the 31st of August, capturing 17 prisoners and killing 3 more at the bridge. On the 1st would be the first rumor of an operational change area. Anderson, another sailor, believed they would be heading to the Red River in Arkansas, even though the Red River is in Louisiana. On the 2nd, the ship would arrive in Paducah, and they would watch the USS Pawpaw head up the Tennessee with mail to take their place. The USS Key West headed via Cairo, Illinois, and Dickinson stated he would rather be at home than be on the Mississippi again. The 3rd would see Dickinson go to shore 13 times that day, but Captain Goody would give a report of their work along the Tennessee River, saying they destroyed 7 flatboats, 3 log rafts, 3 board rafts, and 213 canoes. This is also where the USS Tawa and Dickinson would be departing from Tennessee for several months and going to the White River system. The USS Tawa and its travel to the White River would see them head first to Memphis. They would stop at several points, such as Cairo, Illinois, Mount City, New Madrid, but at Memphis, that's where the ship would begin coaling up again for its long journey up the White River. On the 7th, when they arrived, the ship began coaling up, and the crew would mostly go on liberty. On the 8th, 2 men would be placed on blacklists from Liberty for staying out too late. A Mike Hughes and Jack Martin, who were likely partying up the town. But they would begin to move up late on the 8th towards Helena, Arkansas. On the 9th, they would reach the mouth of the White River, where they met the USS Lexington, the USS Queen City, which Captain Goody was in command of previously, and the USS Benton and Ironclad. They would start up the White River the next day, bound for Duval's Bluff. They would reach Duval's Bluff on the 11th, passing the shipwreck of the Durnall, which I could not find in the official record of the Union or Confederate navies or armies, but they would arrive at 4 p.m. on the 11th. The next day, a convoy of 31 ships would arrive with the USS Linden, USS Nomkeg, USS Hastings, USS Cricket, USS Memora, and the USS Kenwood. The rest were 35 unnamed transport boats. But, to me and most likely most of you, the engineer Lynn and the ship Dog, known as Whiskey, great name for a dog, would land, but Whiskey would get lost. However, the Dog would finally make it back aboard the ship, swimming out to the ship and being picked up by the cutter and brought aboard. On the 13th of September, 1863, Dickinson would be promoted to landsman. Most of the sailors would go on shore on leave, but the day was uneventful. Most of the time he would spend writing letters and enjoying himself on the ship. The 14th saw skirmishes between the Union Army and the picket lines of guerrillas. The 15th saw the Hastings leave downriver, and the Tawa would follow that morning. But on the 16th, with Dickinson hearing cannons early in the morning, around 2:30 a.m., the Confederates were engaging the Hastings. But the Tawa would help, and quickly silenced the raiders after a single broadside. The 17th would see the ship's crew cleaning the guns, as a party would go out to scout a place called Erskine's, and they would come back with muscadines and persimmons before heading back upriver. The 18th saw the Tawa go back to Duval's Bluff, arriving with the Juliet, which had been fired upon the day previously. The Juliet reporting that a transport ship had been captured and sunk upriver to block gunboats from traveling back downstream. On the 19th, the Tawa moved upstream to the village of Little Day's Ark to obtain lumber for the army at Duval's Bluff. Before landing men, they fired on the village. After they halted their bombardment, they landed 65 men to clear out the bushwhackers in the village that were currently raiding it for supplies and routing them, killing mostly only one wounded Union soul, a sailor by the name of Jim Rooney. On the 20th, they would arrive back at port with two other ships, the USS Reindeer, which came from upriver, and the USS Rattler, which came from downriver, but had taken fire at St. Charles Port, where Dickinson would that night be left as port guard, while most of the others went to shore. Compared to Tennessee, the White River would have several different issues, primarily logistical ones. Wood would be the main source of fuel for the ships along this river. Getting coal further upstream was extremely hard due to rapids, whitings, shoals, and the sunken ships in the river that were previously mentioned. But guerrillas and raiders would frequent the banks and shores of the river, though another thing the Tawa would do is assist in army units, especially outside Days Ark, Arkansas, and Duval's Bluff. But during early November would be when the ship began sailing downstream towards Memphis on their way back to the Tennessee River. On the 10th of November, the USS Tawa would arrive in Memphis, see them refuel, and resupply their hardtack. The person who paid them, Purser Stewart Mr. Moreland, was ordered to another boat and replaced by a New Yorker. On the 12th, they would begin upriver towards Cairo. The 12th would see them arrive at 11 p.m. at Cairo, but by that time, Dickinson had already turned in, and the entry would be for the day after. The Tawa would coal and restock on provisions to keep full rations going. Mail would come in on the 13th, and on the 14th they would begin scraping and repainting the hull. The 15th would see them restock again on provisions, ammunition, coal, and other war materials for their next patrol on the Tennessee River. The 16th would see the USS Tawa gain 13 more sailors from the care of Dulcin and leave, reaching Paducah that night. The 16th would see them also help the USS Tyler get off a sandbar she had been stuck on for 9 days. The 17th would see her head up the Tennessee River and drop off mail to the USS Conestoga. They would continue up and reach Hyman on the 17th, which was again occupied by Union soldiers. The 18th saw them pass the original posting of the Bridge, Carrollville, Clifton on their way to Saltillo, reaching it that night. This deployment would see them mostly further downriver. On the 18th, they would also see distress signals of the USS Hastings, which had been stuck on a bar, and they helped tow her off the bar and upriver, reaching Savannah on the 19th, where Confederates had burned the western half of the city. The Hastings would cut loose in tow as the Tawwell would continue upriver, passing Pittsburgh Landing. The 20th would see them dock at Eastport, Mississippi. On the 21st, the pickets up on the mountain above the port would begin firing. Later, a large group of rebels would try deserting. Dickinson said that, in total, there were around 10,000 men, although it is known if that was referring to deserters, Union troops, or both. The 22nd would see the USS Hastings and USS Pawpaw bring up a convoy of 5,000 soldiers, including 2 Zouave regiments. Zouaves are pretty interesting. They're light infantry, which are clothed in these baggy, really bright colored pants, similar to Algerians. Zouaves originally come from France, by the way, which is just another cool thing, but Zouaves are interesting. Both North and South had Zouave units. But the Confederates would continue firing at the ships at Eastport, and eventually the vessels would return fire, killing 2 Union woodcutters from the transports that had been chopping wood. The fighting would continue until the 25th, when the Confederates left the area. 9,000 Union soldiers would leave for Bridgeport, but, more interesting, a sailor enlisted for 2 years with the name Martin Van Buren Zowell. I do not know if this is a spy, as he is not mentioned further, but Martin Van Buren was a politician and well-known person inside Tennessee. That name is... I saw that name and I just thought that either that's a spy or someone stealing a name and has like a more renowned name, or it could also be a contraband, a black man who enlisted. The 26th and 27th saw Union troop movements towards Chattanooga, with the USS Tawa being led by the tin-clad side-wheeled vessel USS Piosta. The rest of the month would see the convoy head to Paducah. The 28th saw them pass Clifton, where they met the 17th Tennessee Cavalry, the Union Cavalry, which, if you didn't know, around 1 million men from the South actively fought against the Confederacy as Union. Tennessee was one of the largest southern states for the Confederacy, especially with the eastern Tennessee being mainly Unionist. Middle and western Tennessee being Confederate, which is ironic because the middle and western Tennessee was held by the Union, while eastern Tennessee was held by the Confederacy for large portions of the war. And there's so much research you could do if you research Tinker Dave or a individual by Champ Ferguson. Both of those were raiders, well, guerrillas. Raiders are actual army units. They were guerrillas in the South, specifically in East Tennessee, that actively fought against each other. And guerrillas are one of the bloodiest parts about the Civil War, especially in Missouri and Arkansas. But in Tennessee, they saw similar levels of violence between them because it was like community versus community fight a lot of the time. But most of the time on the Tennessee River would see Dickinson mostly on board ship, because on the 10th of December, while on leave, Dickinson said that as soon as he went on leave, his exact quote is, "Now I will get drunk as soon as I can," after seeing a bunch of sailors come back to ship extremely drunk. The 11th saw him go ashore, not on leave. And on the 12th, it was the same thing, except he was also writing more letters home. On the 13th, he was granted shore leave, where he had gone to shore, gone to a diner, and he didn't get drunk. He was on leave, didn't get drunk. On the 14th, he did, though. He was complaining about the cold. He was able to go ashore, and he found a rum den where he got drunk. When returning to the ship, he would immediately throw up. He just threw up on the ship, right on the deck as soon as he got up. His friend Anderson got Isham, a black sailor, to clean it up, but he was found out and demoted back to first class boy. The 15th saw him go ashore again with the purser of the ship, known as the Old Ogre, who was purchasing candy for Captain Goody's son, of which $1's worth during this period of time is 3 pounds worth of candy. 3 pounds. Yeah, that's a lot of candy. After helping the purser collect candy for Goody's child, the Tawa would head back up the Tennessee River again. At this time, it was December. It was cold, and Christmas saw them having a nice dance party, though Dickinson did not get to enjoy it as he was on guard duty that night. Several nights later, the 30th, he would be on guard duty after relieving Charlie Newton, because the Confederates were trying to burn and or sink coal barges that night, but he likely didn't engage anyone or see anyone. The 31st saw Dickinson buy a chicken, cleaning it, and having Anderson say he would roast it, but he didn't that night. On the 1st of January, he took over for a Timmy O'Keefe, although Dickinson could hardly walk, but Anderson made him that roast chicken that night. The 2nd would see him put on the sick list as his legs were frozen and he had to use crutches to limp around the ship. The 3rd saw him called to inspection and double muster, but he was given permission to put his hammock over the stove, but he still wasn't doing well. He said he couldn't sleep well, and on the 4th, him and the other injured sailors, John Coyle, Dave Thomas, and Larry Lang, went ashore. They paid dinner, which was 25 cents Confederate. Another cool fact is the Confederacy had its own currency opposite to the greenbacks that the Union used, called the graybacks. And his dinner was a bowl of milk and bread. The 5th saw Dickinson seeing the doctor and being told his toenails will come off. He ended up writing letters most of that day. The 8th saw Thomas and Sims, which were the two guerrillas fattening up for the sacrifice, shot at Pleasant Point before the ship returned back to Clifton. The 9th saw Dickinson taken off sick leave, and for the most part, Dickinson would continue to play guard on the ship. They caught 5 guerrillas catching a canoe. One of the individuals on the ship was injured in the leg, and Anderson was put on sick leave with fever and ague, which ague is kind of a generalist term for a feverish malaise of sorts. The 15th would see several ships leave, such as the Key West and the Piosta. The Piosta would continue upriver. The Key West would head downriver with Captain Goody, who would go to see his wife and child. Because, I mean, it's that period. Yeah, you could just leave your ship in the middle of a war zone and go see your family. But no, Captain Goody apparently was an extremely good captain. He was well received, especially in the official records. And he commanded several ships at the same time before getting the Tawa. Continuing on with January, the 27th would see 2 ex-Confederates come aboard and swear the oath of allegiance. Dickinson would buy corn pone and fresh butter from a black woman, likely in a contraband camp, and on the 28th, they would see problems that arose because of the ship being close to one of the army units known as the Groundhogs. The Groundhogs are a cool unit to research as well, but while docked close by, a scouting party went out to hunt for fresh meat. They returned with chicken and eggs, which I don't think you hunt for, but they ate that night so they could save their beef for the next day. The next day came around and the local groundhog unit had come aboard saying someone stole their honey, chicken, and eggs. While Dickinson was not a part of the work crew, so he could not confirm, he did, however, say a Mr. Neve would search the ship and find only honey found in the black mess. The blacks had not been a part of the shore party the day before. Someone definitely hid it there to possibly cover themselves and not get in trouble. But nobody got in trouble because of this, because it's obvious. The black soldiers and black sailors on board the ship didn't do it. So, actually finding out who did it would be extremely hard during this period. The rest of the time on the river would be relatively boring. One thing that I do think was cool, Dickinson hadn't spoken about previously, and I can't find records on the ship, mostly because, well, you'll find out later. I don't want to spoil anything for you guys, but he did mention that the engine was producing 135 pounds of steam and making about 15 revolutions per minute. I don't know if this was at full speed or half speed, but this was a little light on the top speed of a ship during that period. In the official records, you can find some talks about the USS Tarawa, especially later in its career, where they essentially said that it was a ship that was becoming poor. The condition was becoming worn, and while at the beginning when it was first received, the ship was praised on multiple occasions, but this is, you can start seeing where the ship is going downhill. This is likely due to using wood over coal, and there is quality of coal. A lot of the coal we have is somewhat low quality, especially if you use it in your grills or anything like that. A lot of higher grade coal, like anthracite, you find more in power plants. Little weird side tangent, but coal is something that's super cool, and using a wood or a charcoal secondary compared to wood, you're not going to get a lot of power output, and all of the time on the White River and all the times where they've had to conserve the amount of coal they have, that possibly could damage the engine quite a bit. This is also a good time to talk about reenlistment. The 14th would see Anderson, McClellan, also known as Sherman, and Dickinson talking about their reenlistment, if they decided to reenlist. Ultimately, Dickinson likely re-enlisted in the army after getting back into Fremont, Ohio after the war. He doesn't say it, but he does talk about it quite a bit, and it is mentioned in later newspaper articles that mention him that he was a part of the military, not just the Navy. But there is a key difference between the Army and Navy at the time. The Army had higher recruiting potential, primarily because they got bounties, they got more furlough, they got a higher pay, they got more time on leave, so they had a lot more options, and more people were focused into joining the Army for those reasons. The Navy didn't get bounties, their furlough was relatively short, and their pay was a lot less. Another thing, February 16th would see Dickinson put in irons with a Jim Rooney and a Lemuel Cook. The three had been on liberty, and the other two had gotten drunk. The three of them got into a fight with the provost guards, which are essentially, at this point in time, military police. And Dickinson said they gave them a good fight before he got arrested. Another crew member got them out and put them on irons on the boat. The 17th saw the other two get out of irons. Cook had an illness, but Dickinson stayed in irons until the 18th, when John Martel and Maurice Fitzgerald were placed in double irons, with another person known as Joe Minor put in single irons. Continuing onwards, another major point on the river would be the 21st of February. 21st of February, they would head back upriver. This is where we see another major function of the Union Western Flotilla, and that is raiding. So, one of the things that they could do quite freely along with cavalry units is raid guerrilla hideouts, outposts, logistics stations, and points, similar to what the guerrillas were doing with them. But for them, it was more needed. While, yes, they could easily go back to Paducah or another part of the river and resupply, they do oftentimes have to collect resources on the go, especially if they want better resources, and especially if they want better food, because salt beef and salt pork with dried vegetables, or as it's put in the 1848 lists of supplies on a naval vessel, desiccated vegetables, which just it does not sound appetizing at all. And this could be anything from greens and onions to potatoes. Yeah, they've got like flour and other things to make dishes out of, but it is still somewhat monotonous, and having things other than that fresh food is definitely a morale booster. But this is also coming up to the Siege of Paducah by Nathan Bedford Forrest, right before his Fort Pillow massacre. Dickinson would get hit on the 27th. While they were not heading to Paducah yet, they had not even heard about it yet. Dickinson heard a rumor the 28th, but on the 22nd, Dickinson would be shot again. This time, there is a Confederate guerrilla riding his horse near Cuba Landing, who opened fire with his pistol. Dickinson was the only one hit, and he was hit in the knee. Due to the range, and due to black powder not being as powerful as modern rounds, it did not enter his knee, it did not pierce the skin, but it was enough to break the flesh just a little bit and both burned and bruised his knee. While the fight for Paducah happened, the Tawa would be up and down the Tennessee River. The guerrillas were out in full force. Forrest was attacking Paducah, and on the 2nd, they would learn from the USS Piosa and USS Paw Paw that those two ships repelled around 10,000 men, estimating around 2,000 Confederate losses. This would also be when Nathan Bedford Forrest would head to East Tennessee to Fort Pillow, and the entire Fort Pillow massacre would take place, where his soldiers would slaughter the black Union soldiers and the local Eastern Tennessee regiments that were there. It's a highly controversial topic, but the Navy was involved. The ship wasn't able to fire back at Forrest, and the troops that were there were either undermanned, undersupplied, or just extremely untrained, especially the black soldiers, most of them being contraband previously in the area, and then all of the white soldiers often being killed because they fought alongside the black soldiers. When we take a look away from Fort Pillow and go back to Dickinson, the rest of this time on the USS Tawa would be relatively similar to each and every day. It would be fighting and or resupply. They would get new clothes, and you would see pretty much what his life was like in a general sense: fighting, mail, resupply. However, there is a bit of that flair, that drama in his life, as on the 12th of April he would receive his last letter from a friend of his, a writing partner, named Alice Beaufort. This is because she would have died sometime during this period. We know of her death because on the 18th of April, he receives a letter from a Joe Batig with news that Alice had died of a sudden attack of spotted fever, and no other information was given on that day. But he would continue his service, and the last entry in his diary, the main part of it, would be on the 6th of May. From here, the addendum from his second journal would pick up on the 23rd. We know from his last entry on the 6th that he would not re-enlist in the Navy. They do not get bounties, they do not get a clothing allowance, and they have smaller pay than the Army. His journey home would first see him depart Paducah from Mound City on a ship. That ship had Major General Sickles on it with him. The 25th would see him arrive in Cairo and continue heading towards Mound City, where he would procure a ticket for Cleveland on the Chicago-Toledo line. He would reach Chicago on the 26th and get a train for Toledo. On May 27th, he would reach Fremont after taking the Helper's bus from Toledo, where his self-ridden journey had finally ended. As we look at the life of James Dickinson in the Navy, we can see several parts of history in it. First, we can see the brown water navy. Most people do not think of a navy being an inland source. Fun fact, Mongolia has a navy which overlooks a lake system, I believe, or it's a river system inside Mongolia. I believe it's a tugboat. But lakes and rivers are just as important as oceans. Most of the major cities in the world, in definitely ancient history, were placed alongside rivers. It's an extremely good source of transportation, and here in the United States, one of the most inland ports we have is in Idaho on the west coast. Besides that, you also have the Great Lakes, which have a plethora of ports dotting the coastline there. Same along the Mississippi. Cairo is still a major city. Cleveland is alongside the river. Nashville's alongside the river. Memphis. All of these places still interact with the river just about as much as they did back then. A little less because railroad and truck transportation has become more popular in recent years. But for a long time, those rivers were the ancient highways of the United States. Secondly, as we look over to different parts of guerrilla warfare, we can explore both guerrillas within Arkansas and Tennessee. He mostly dealt with the regular kind of insurgents, the regulars, the raiders. But you still have terms such as bushwhacker, guerrilla, and sorts being used. You also see how the Union combats these insurgents. A piece of my thesis interacts with a figure known as Leroy Fitch. He was a lieutenant commander in the Navy during the Civil War, but a writer known as Myron Smith essentially builds him up as he did create the tactics used in the anti-guerrilla campaigns, where Fitch's tactics that he created were used up until the World War periods, when they would be used against U-boats, the insurgents of the sea. Then lastly, the more topical issues of racial relations of soldiers in the Civil War, and the use of child soldiers in the Civil War. Because up until that period, the United States had not employed black soldiers. The army was still very much more prevalent, but in the initial stages of the war, blacks, especially contraband, did not want to join the army as often as they did the Navy, as lower pay and things like that. The army also had pushed them away with various propaganda forces to get blacks on board. In the initial stages, more blacks joined the Navy, but in general, far more joined the army. In comparison, the army had a lower percentage, but the Navy had around a 20% enlistment rate of blacks compared to whites. So 80% were white, 20% were black. With child soldiers, it is a lot more prevalent during this age, and even until the World Wars in Vietnam, you still see children lying about their age to join the military. There was not regulations really put in until the Second World War and just before, and that was only with one branch, the Marines, which required a birth certificate, although some individuals would still make it into the Marines, one of which being a Medal of Honor recipient. But the youngest Medal of Honor recipient came out of the Civil War, and there was a lot of them. The Navy, all navies during this time period, especially had large amounts of child soldiers and sailors because they were smaller, they could fit into tight spaces, and they could move fast with, say, a cast of powder or some other unit of charge for the main cannons, or for any of the cannons that, by that matter. But I thank you for listening to my video. This was a first for me, recording a video of this length. I'm sorry for the amateurness in it, but it is my first time creating a video this long. And I do have help from my friend Marco out in California, as he's helping me edit this. And I thank pretty much everyone else who has helped me along the way, from my professors, my thesis counsel, and pretty much everyone. A huge shout out to Drachinifel and Fat Electrician, as those are the first two names that come to my mind as academic scholars on YouTube, even if one is more of a storyteller than a scholar. All of the images used in this video I have gained from either Library of Congress, Wikipedia, and hopefully they should be fair use, or from the Rutherford B. Hayes archive with the photo of James Dickinson. I thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.